This morning, I am excited to welcome someone to the podcast who has such a variety of knowledge. And he's been gracious to join me in sharing that knowledge with myself and listeners. So I'd like to welcome Chief Andrew George, Hereditary Wing Chief of the Wet'suwet'en Bear Clan. He's also BC's first Indigenous Red Seal chef and director at Dan's Legacy Foundation. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Rachel. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Chief George and I had a discussion in advance, and I was just so blown away by his knowledge and the way in which he put the issue of hunger and food insecurity under a different lens that very much connected to the cultural elements of Indigenous communities, as well as so many other elements that he explained to me around his work and passions. So I would like to start by acknowledging the land on which I work and live here in South Surrey. It is the unceded territory, traditional territory, Semiahmoo, Katsi, Kwantlen, and other Coast Salish peoples. Now, when I say that land acknowledgement, I do so with respect of the land I'm on, but also in recognition of my personal ignorance and my gratitude to you for teaching and educating when there are so many non-Indigenous people, such as myself, who have much to learn. So thank you for doing that. Chief George, you work in a variety of areas. So you are an Apprentice Advisor at SkilledTradesBC, a Red Seal chef, a Hereditary Wing Chief, and the list goes on. I'd like to focus on food today and the significant number of people who are going hungry here in BC. Focus on Indigenous communities and what you're doing with Dan's Legacy, because I think that's vital. But can we start by hearing more about your journey into food? BC's first Indigenous Red Seal certified chef. Can you talk about that?
Sure. Thanks, Rachel. First of all, Dadize, Zakoze, Skyze, Hadi Sawanzen, Saizozi, Skaden, Wet'suwet'en. Good morning, male chiefs, women chiefs, children of the chiefs, special guests. My name is Skaden, Andrew George, and I am Wet'suwet'en from North Central British Columbia. And it's a pleasure actually being here today. It's something that is very close to my heart, which is food. And the importance of food, basically, and culture, which stems from where I come from, and basically where I come from and how I got into professional cooking was basically out of a need at first, and way back then, and I was born almost in the middle of the other century, but growing up in the Bulkley Valley, a very rich area in food production. But growing up off reserve, and that was the choice by my grandparents, Thomas George and Mary George. Thomas George was Gistewe, and Mary George was Sebesa. And they chose to remove our family off reserve to fight the residential school. So my father and his brothers and sisters started attending school in the 1920s in Hubert, which is now close to Telkwa. And part of that was ranching and farming. My grandparents had a very large farm, a very, very large potato field, and very rich soil by the Bulkley River, or in our language called Wet'suwet'en, which is the greenish-blue river. And lots of potatoes and root vegetables, and at that time caribou was our main staple. And obviously salmon. We are the Salmon People, the Wet'suwet'en, which are part of the Salmon People, which extend basically from the Alaska Panhandle to Oregon, which basically means we follow the cycle of the salmon. So we're seasonal people. And growing up in the 1960s in Telkwa off reserve, and having a traditional upbringing, I actually grew up in the territories under the eyes of the Wet'suwet'en Hereditary Chiefs, predominantly my father clan, my father Andrew George Sr., my late father Tsebe Sa. He was part of the Killer Whale clan. And my mother, who's the matriarch, Galachkan, Rita George, who is 86 and lives in Burns Lake or Broman Lake, or in our language is called Kakuz. And she and my father taught us a very traditional upbringing until I was out of high school. Even right now, this time of year, we'd be out in the bush and we'd be actually pulling in trout right now. And that's our first access to fresh food back then, and particularly in the 60s. And I just love that because we walked miles and miles, walked the same trails that my grandfather did, my great grandfathers, and cooked in the same campsites and slept in the same campsites. So it's a generational thing, and it still happens today. My brothers and sisters are up there today fishing, and I bring my granddaughter up there as well. So this tradition is still alive and well. So part of that, of growing up out there, living off the bounty of the land, and not, I didn't see it as being very poor because we were rich in resources, and we never ever went hungry. That was never in the picture because food is very critical to us through culture, and was attached to the feast hall, or potlatch, or in the Wet'suwet'en language it's called Potlatch. And what that is in our culture we have 5 clans, and every clan is basically a manager of an ecosystem, a whole watershed that is assigned to that specific family. So we manage that for generations. And the bounty of that stuff we bring in from our ecosystems of the watershed go into the feast hall. And the feast hall is there as a governing body for our people. That was our governing body. And what we did with our food is everybody got a piece of that food. Nobody was left out. It showed the bounty of our territories and how well our clan looked after it. And it was for everybody, including the salmon. And besides our feast hall of the past, it was also bartering tools through the grease trails that are very prevalent in British Columbia, and is named after the Ulican grease. So the Wet'suwet'ens participated in this bartering, which is basically a kinship economy. There was no money involved. It was all based on bartering and keeping a balance in the system. So the salmon was dried in a smokehouse, and which made it very light. So you could pack a couple hundred salmon in a bentwood box and carry it over the ridge and carry it to the interior to trade for caribou, and bring that caribou meat back towards the coast. And vice versa, we actually brought caribou and moose to the coast and got dried halibut and clams, herring roe and kelp, and seaweed. And that's still alive today, even though it's 2026. This still happens in the Indigenous communities, is we barter. So there's no money that exchanges food. So going back to how I grew up, is besides going out in the territories hunting, fishing, picking berries, my mother and father also had a garden. And we lived in a tiny little house, a little 4-bedroom or a 4-room house along the Highway 16 back then in Telkwa. And I grew up with 16 of my cousins in and around there, and we were off reserve, so we were kind of caught between 2 cultures, but we looked after each other. Our summers were spent at the river, fishing and just playing and catching, cooking our fish right there. So as we grew older, my dad was involved in mining, and he was a prospector. And so we had working with a company in the Telkwa Mountains. So in 1980, I think it was in grade 10, I went in there to go do some soil sampling and working with the mining company because I loved it in the mountains. And nobody knew how to cook. So I ended up doing breakfast, lunch, and dinner on an open fire. And they loved it. And I still did my day job. But word got back to the high school. He said, hey, man, this guy can cook. And they tried to talk me into going into cooking school. And I said, I want to be a geologist. I love it in the mountains. And that's where I want to go. So it took them a while to talk me into doing this, and then I talked to my parents about it, and my dad was really thrilled. He said, I'll go into the trades. And if you go into cooking, you'll never go hungry because everybody needs to eat.
Yes.
And what my dad said, though, he says, go forward, go for it. and show the world what we can do as a people,
I love that.
and show them. And it was a tough journey. So that's actually how I got into professional cooking. And when I first graduated, and they said, we're gonna send you to terrace. And I said, no, I don't want to go to terrace. Nothing against terrace. I love terrace. Prince George, same thing. And they said, where do you want to go? I said, Vancouver. You ever been to Vancouver? I said, 5 years ago at a student exchange, I was there for 2 weeks. And they said, yeah, but it's a city. And I said, well, I want to go there because if I want to do this, I want to train in a big hotel. But the reason why I say that story, Rachel, is up to 1986, we weren't allowed to go to post-secondary Indigenous people.
I see.
The only thing we were allowed to take was a pre-employment program. So that's actually how I got into cooking, was a pre-employment program. And I attended Vancouver Vocational Institute at the time in 1984, and wasn't used to the city, and was late for school, so they locked the door, and that was just what they did back then. Yeah. And talked my way into class, and they said, don't ever be late again, and I never was. But it was hard, and particularly going into a trade that was predominantly non-native and European, and the chefs were all European, and tough as nails back then. But at the end of the day, they taught me a lot, because they taught me discipline, because I already had that because of how I grew up. Yeah, I think the biggest thing I faced back then was acceptance.
Yeah.
Just accepting who I was. And you know what? A lot of the students did accept me. And once I started feeling comfortable, I got 13 B's and an A, and I thought, you know what? I can do this. And yeah, so that's how I actually got into professional cooking.
Who would have thought that as you were cooking over that campfire, casually to most, people didn't know how the food would taste. And years later, you are basically running the food show, running the food for the Indigenous Pavilion at the Olympics and soon to be FIFA.
Well, it all started at Expo. And my first job out of cooking school was the Quillicum restaurant, which was on Davie and Denman at the time, 1985. It was an Indigenous restaurant. And oh man, I was in heaven, because it was a wood-burning grill. So it brought me right back to the territories where we grilled salmon heads and salmon and halibut and oysters and caribou. And man, it was a great experience. But I ended up at the Expo site 40 years ago this year, and talked my way into there because they weren't going to open it. And the late Bob Hall, who's Dolo, talked to me about it. And he says, you know what? We need a red seal to open that restaurant, and there's no Indigenous red seals. And I said, well, I'll get one once we finish Expo. And they said, no, that's not good enough. You need one to actually run this. And just so happened the German chefs from the pavilion next door said, well, we'll help them and we'll take them on. And so that's actually how that restaurant opened. And I kept my promise. After Expo 86, I got an apprenticeship. And probably one of the toughest neighborhoods as an Indigenous person, which was Kerrsdale, a very affluent neighborhood in Vancouver. And that was quite, and forever being told you're not good enough, you'll never make it. And that's a message to the youth out there. That was always told to me. But I went back to my parents, and they said, well, why can't you, what did they say? And I said, I don't have the credential. And they said, go back to school. So I went back to school and I went back, said, here you go. And they said, okay, come on in. And then when I got my apprenticeship, they said, your people will be proud. Now you can go back to your village. And I'm just like, what are they talking about? What village are they talking about? Telkwa's a village.
You're not nearly done.
I said, Telkwa's a village, but it's not the kind of village you're thinking about. I said, no, I'm not finished. I'm just getting started. And every point in my way through my journey, I was told, what are you doing here? How did you get in here? And I said, I got my ticket. I went to school. And it was both sides. But you know what? As I went through this journey, it all boils down to a good education. And when you look at a good education like that, what my parents taught me and my grandparents was continuous education and keep a balance in your life, whether it's a Western education and a traditional education. So now I have two worlds, and that was quite the journey and quite a lesson to learn. And to me, it goes back to just being proud of yourself, be proud of where you come from, and where I ended up today is promoting culture through food, which I love called culture on a plate. So again, now I go to my mom's side of the family, and the story I told you about my grandfather on my mom's side. And this is a European contact back in Burns Lake. And when this elder approached my grandparents' house and asked for used tea bags.
Yes, let me stop you and premise that this is a story that I asked Chief George to tell because it just blew me away with its. Anyway, I'll let you continue. This is important. This is important.
And I appreciate that, Rachel, but I think it was more than my grandfather. It was like this right across Canada, and our people welcomed uh, and fed the newcomers, or they never would have survived. And I never met my grandfather, Paddy Isaac, hit by a car in 1960, and I was born in 1963. But he had a tie camp, and they helped build Grand Trunk Pacific. So my grandfather employed Indigenous people from Prince Rupert to Prince George, and they all worked for him. So he's very well known in that era of economics. And a lot of people don't look at that in today's world. But what I'm getting at is through that, they had a post office and a grocery store by his house, which is now, um, it's the parcel of land is still there. But what the story I told you was there was an elderly man that came to the door and wanted some used tea bags so he could warm up his family. And my grandfather asked him what for, and he says, I want it for my family. And they lived out by Rose Lake, which is probably a good half-day walk back then. And my grandfather said, no, I'm not going to give you used tea bags. And come on in. And they gave him a box of tea and some food and warmed him up and fed him and set him on his way. Did 50 some odd years later, became one of the largest logging operations in that area. I just hate to say it, the treatment of my family wasn't very good. And that what was did to that family and was forgotten. And I think people have to remember our people have always been on a journey of reconciliation, and particularly the elders, because they no one ever speaks to the elders, but when we talk to the elders, you know, we're all here. We all have to learn to live together, and part of that is food. That is the big part. Is again part of your questions is why I do what I do at SkilledTradesBC. You know, it's something that I was proud of. First of all, becoming the chef and taking our cuisine to the World Culinary Olympics in 1992. And you mentioned the 2010 Games, the World Expo in 1986, and now the FIFA World Cup. And just looking at that, and why do I pursue that kind of thing? To me, it's an educational thing. First of all, is if you allow us to evolve as a people, look what we can do. But not only that, I think a lot of people are missing the boat. Everybody looks at the politics of things. And why do they want this? Why do they want that? It's important, something that we all need is food. And, you know, I get involved with a lot of things like this, and people, why? And I said, because of the decimation of our food. There's a history there that nobody ever talks about, right from the East Coast to the West Coast. And if you see what they did to the cod on the East Coast and totally wiped out that stock for commercialization. But when you get to the prairies in the 1800s, when they wiped out the buffalo, and that was all for land and resources. It was simply just to get rid of the indigenous peoples. And the same thing happened here on the West Coast. In the Wet'suwet'en territories, one of our main fishing villages, Tsekia, which is now Hazelton, We had a fishing rock there, and they blew that rock out underneath the Hagelgate Canyon. That was one of our main fishing rocks, and they told Department of Fisheries blew that out in the 1940s and 50s. And what that was is decimation of the salmon stock. And why did they do that? Well, if we're going to decimate a people, we have to decimate their food. But at the end of the day, why is that all happening? And it boils down to access to land and resources. It's that simple. And again, it just devastated our food systems. And that's why I do what I do, is our food systems are drastically depleted. But not only that, today's food, if you can't pronounce it, don't eat it.
The reason that we initially connected, Chief George and myself, was the issue of food insecurity, where people are using food banks than ever before, where people are going hungry. According to Science Direct, Indigenous households across the province of BC experience high rates of food insecurity, 2 to 6 times higher than non-Indigenous households. So we're in a public health crisis, and you've identified the vital cultural component and elements, connection between food and culture for Indigenous peoples. And I wanted to ask you, Chief George, the issue of hunger, as you see today, amongst both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in such a rich nation. We're in British Columbia, and Vancouver is a very well-off city. How do you feel seeing so many people go hungry?
It's actually a very sad state of affairs, actually, when you look at what you just said there, one of the richest countries in the world, and access to the land and resources for exactly that, to exploit it for money. And to me, that's, I'm not here to fight progression or economics, that's needed, but not at the cost of our culture. And it's not just the indigenous culture, it's cost of a lot of people's culture. And to me, there are better things, there are better ways of doing things. Yeah, but to me, when you look at, let's go back to resource extraction, and the only place I can really talk about it is the Wet'suwet'en territories, and what logging did to our territories, and resource extraction that drastically affected our food supply and our food systems in the Wet'suwet'en territory. First of all, in the 1950s, our main staple was caribou. I think it was 1952 that the herd left the Telkwa Mountains, just totally disappeared. They were seen swimming across Babine Lake and went north and never been seen again. And then in came the moose. And the reason why the caribou left, my dad said, is the start of resource extraction. And so the caribou just left. And then in come the logging. And then back then you had little tiny sawmills all over the place in the 60s and 70s. But in 1970, opened Northwood, the world's largest sawmill in Houston. So in come the big cut blocks and totally mismanaged the forest. And these big cut blocks not only just taken everything, but when they replanted it and sprayed those cut blocks to kill everything around it to grow that tree. To me, that still has effects today, because what was sprayed in those cut blocks is deadly, because you know what? None of those plants lived. But who ate those trees and who ate those plants? Moose, deer, and grouse, and rabbit. And it sprayed on our berries. And it was run off into our rivers, and who knows, it's in our salmon. So this kind of effect on our food. And this, I'm sad to say, what it boils down to is the Indian Act. And everybody talks about residential schools, but that's a stem from the Indian Act. And everything that goes around us is because of the Indian Act. First of all, the Indian Act divides us as a people.
Yeah.
We can't come together as one to discuss these issues. Something as critical as food. And I think, going down to my position, I'm no longer an apprenticeship advisor. I've moved up the ladder. I'm now director of Truth and Reconciliation. And part of that is Indigenous programming in the province, and a large part of that is food. And I was part of a committee that helped create professional cook Indigenous content. which is a template that are now can be used with the nations that work with the local communities. Example is I was the executive chef at Nicola Valley Institute of Technology from 2019 to 2021 to put this to the test, and it took the whole town of Merritt to deliver this program, which is pretty cool. We used the hunters from the intercontinent. They went out and got us some deer and beaver meat, and that's what they learned on. We used the local farmers for garlic and chicken and beef, everything that was grown in the Nicola Valley, even cantaloupe and watermelon, believe it or not. And to me, that's food security because the whole town benefited off of this. And part of that program, Rachel, is growing your own food for a culinary course. And there was a greenhouse at MVIT still there. So growing your own herbs, your own vegetables for a culinary course. And then I reached out and created a relationship with Chalouse Gardens, which is the Lower Nicola Indian Band. And now we got fresh fruit and vegetables right from the Nicola Valley. And the kids learn off of that. And I think that's the proper way of doing things because it involved the whole community. And to me, when you look at that, for SkilledTradesBC to look at that, and it's still being put to the test. But at the end of the day, it's a very critical thing because even prior to that, I ran a program in Surrey, in Wally, at the Culinary Aboriginal Center, Ahalia Aboriginal Center. And it's the same kind of program. This was introductory to culinary arts. And what we did, this was from 2006 to 2011. And this was all about food and to get off the streets. And again, this is where Dan's legacy comes in eventually because it's a wellness program. They went through therapy and everything before they got into my cook program. They got the basics of cooking, and then off they went to VCC. And I think we did about 260 students from 2006 to 2011. About 80 of them went to VCC. I'm proud to say 20 of them aced that program, and 5 of them became tutors of the general population of the culinary program of VCC. But the main thing I witnessed through that whole program was basically their main meal of the day, what we cooked in class. So I started looking at food security in the city and taking my experience as a Wet'suwet'en and bartering with the local community. So get this, I took all our scraps rather than composting them. I reached out to a farmer and he gladly took our scraps and came to fresh eggs. And now we got fresh farm eggs, and they took all that. Didn't cost me nothing. And so just bartering with the local community, and they loved it. And this was right in Surrey. But the whole thing was just an educational proponent and actually giving our young youth the essential skills to move forward in life. And it was more than just Indigenous. This was low-income kids and street kids. So I don't see any difference from anybody. We're here to help everybody because everybody's in the same boat when it comes to food. So when you have food security, what are we talking about? I think, I tend to ramble on, but go back to your questions. And Dan's legacy.
Yes.
Dan's legacy will play a very key role in this whole scene. And just to back up a little bit of history about Dan's legacy, unfortunately, it's a sad story how it began. And Dan was a cook, a chef, that did himself in because of mental health. And his mother reached out to Tom Littlewood and asked for help, and we need to address this. And I was an apprenticeship advisor back then, and they approached me and pitched the idea of we need to help this mom. And they told me the story, and I said, you know what? On 2012, I was in the United States on what they called the Culinary Diplomacy Tour of America. And that was put together by Hillary Clinton at the time. And the reasoning for that was to look at food and culture in the United States and identify what is American cuisine. And so we looked at all the high-end restaurants, high-end schools, soup kitchens, community kitchens, you name it. And what a great tour. I went from New York City, Chicago, Washington, D.C., Des Moines, Iowa, of all places, out to San Francisco, Napa Valley, Dallas, and then into New Orleans.
Oh, I was going to ask if you went to New Orleans.
And Nolans, yeah. What the Nolans? But part of that was witnessing what I seen in Washington, D.C., which is a place called BC Central Kitchen. I think the province of BC has to look at this. And this is way back in 2012. And what this was is a program in the poor area of Washington, D.C. And this is a big capital of the United States. You know, what Washington, D.C. did was donated a warehouse to this group, and what they did is built an industrial kitchen. And not only that, they did a food rescue program in Washington, D.C. and created a culinary program. But before they got into that culinary program, they had to go through therapy and detox and all of this stuff. And back then, when I went there at 2012, it was a $5 million a year operation back then, and it was running for about 25 years. So now you tack on another 13, 14 years, it's probably a $10 million operation through rescued food. And a lot of those kids go on to be executive chefs in those hotels in Washington, D.C., which is a very cool thing. I also witnessed one in Nolans at a very small scale, which was called Liberty Kitchen. And that was non-government funded, but same thing. They grew their own food. They're right outside this little cafe, a little bit of rescued food. So this can be done. And if you look at the downtown east side and what we did in Wally, this thing can be achieved in the downtown east side to help with that. It's not a problem, and there is never a problem in the downtown east side. The problem is the system. The system has failed those people. That's what's going on. So people have to look at it differently. And the system is not kind to people that fall through the cracks.
It's not.
And so part of that is a wellness program, much how us as Indigenous people look at things. There's a wellness proponent before you even think about going to do anything. So part of this whole thing is getting well. And that's what I like about Dan's legacy, is the therapy. And when a youth approaches Dan's legacy and opens up and just says, I need some help. And so they go through this therapy program. And when I joined that, I said, let's instill some cooking, because I thought about the DC Central Kitchen. And now there's a little culinary program attached to it where they go through this, if they choose to, go into the cooking and learn how to cook. And there's a bicycle repair program or anything else, but there's also a Dan's Diner there in New Westminster on 11th if anybody's interested there. There's a little food window, and oh man, the food is fantastic. We have a catering division that does events in the city, and the kids that do it come from Dan's legacy. And it's all rescued food, and it is absolutely delicious. And there's a lot of other little companies like Ono Vancouver, where my son worked, that do the same thing. Then, you know what? We barely scratch the surface. And Dan's legacy has done a good job, and I've been with them for quite a while, but I don't really think we scratch the surface. And if we all work together, forget about the politics and figure out, hey man, people need our help. And we get all these corporations like Save on Foods and Loblaws, and have a central kitchen like this. And what I liked about the model in Washington, D.C., it shut down all the soup kitchens in the city, but they became holding kitchens where all the soup came in already made. Everything was already made, and they just distributed it. So they became just distribution kitchens. But again, when you look at that and use that food, and now we go into the gardening. And I want to talk to you about a wonderful program in the north, and that's Tea Creek. Tea Creek is another aspect of food sovereignty and food security. When people look at food sovereignty, their backs are up against the wall. Like, sovereignty, what's that all about? It's the same thing as food security, but it's a little different. And what this is actually getting back to who you are. What I love about Tea Creek is opening a door and feeding the communities with fresh vegetables they didn't have access to before because of the cost in the north. and Jacob Beaton and Jessica. I take my hats off to them for doing this because they help a lot of families. And when they do that and they go through this wellness program, and not only that, they learn how to garden and feed their families. And then eventually think of taking on a trades program because they do trades exploration. So SkilledTradesBC comes back into the picture. So they do a culinary program right on site there. They do carpentry. They do auto service tech. And they're very successful. And again, it's all about food security. There's lots of room in this province for this. And I encourage everybody to have a second look at society, and particularly today's world, what's going on down in the south, and what's going to happen, and the cost of things is just outrageous. At the store the other day, and man, it's like $9 for a cauliflower. I was like, holy smokes.
No, it's out of control.
So that's
Um,
why I think it's really critical about what we're talking about.
it is critical, Chief George, and I wanted to ask you something. This is going back to reconciliation, but also the value, the tremendous value that always having Indigenous peoples at the table for all sorts of discussions around issues we're facing in society and what they can bring to the table via their knowledge, culture, different perspective, experience, things they have learned, whether in their lifetime, like yourself, or via discussions and learnings from elders. Do you agree that really ensuring that Indigenous peoples are at the table at all of these vital discussions?
I agree. I fully agree with that, Rachel. First of all, a little bit of a story here. First of all, take that table, break it down, burn it, build a fire, make some tea, invite your guests, sit around a fire, and let's discuss this. That's how you do it. You walk into a boardroom, a corporate boardroom, it's quite
Yes,
intimidating,
yes.
and it's not people friendly, even to the people that work there. So, a little bit of human approach here. I have a story for you that an elder told me in my travels through SkilledTradesBC because I get to cover the whole province. And he says, you know what? When you do that, watch how much tea that person drinks, because you know who wants to learn. And if you want to pour them more tea, and they said, no thanks, I'm okay. But you monitor that, and you sit there and you watch the people that drink tea and they want another tea, and you fill up their cup, and you fill it up again. But that person that says, no, no thanks, I'm good. You know that person that said, I'm good, you already know they know too much, and they don't want to hear you. And when they ask for a second cup of tea, you know you got their attention and they want to learn more. So that's a little bit an analogy from an elder that can tell who's listening. And he says, see, you finished your tea. Would you like a second cup of tea? So my message to the government and corporate out there is slow down. Have a cup of tea with elders, and it's called breaking bread. And there's no better way to do this. And again, just get out of the boardroom. I've done this in the 90s in the north when I was with the Office of the Wet'suwet'en, and we brought the corporate camphor out into our territories, and we did the same thing. We built a fire, we made bannock on the
I love
campfire, and we
bannock.
drank tea.
I love bannock.
And the elders got to speak, and a relationship was created. And I think overall, what I'm saying here, I don't mean to go into every boardroom and burn those tables, but
Although maybe it should
uh,
be done.
build, build those tables together. And that's how things are done. And I think that really has to resonate with everybody because our people are very, very rich in knowledge, in traditional knowledge, but in the Western knowledge as well. Because, I don't want to get political, but 60, 70% of us live off reserve. And there's a reason for that. A lot of us pursued a post-secondary education. So a lot of our brothers and sisters out there know exactly what's going on. But because of our culture, we're very patient. But again, when you look at, we need to start moving pieces. And that's where the Jacob Beatons of the world come in. To have that vision of Tea Creek. Tom Littlewood at Dan's Legacy. And to me, when you combine the two worlds, traditional knowledge and Western knowledge, but not only that, traditional practices through our systems and our food systems and governing systems, and people actually slowing down and actually listening. And it's like, oh, wow. Because when you look at the two different worlds, in the Western world, it's everything for a fast buck right now. I mean, let's make a quick buck. In our world, everything is connected because if you affect one thing, you can affect another. There's a ripple effect through everything. And everybody's wondering, what the heck's going on? It's our ecosystems are so damaged.
Yes.
And, everybody's afraid of the drought that's coming. But if you work together to instill proper land management and growth, not only of gardening, but our food forests, and getting rid of pesticides and herbicides and strengthening everything again and revitalizing it. It can be done. It's being done right now in the prairies and the reintroduction of some of the buffalo herds. And now you're going into a modern form. You talked about FIFA. And now we take our food and we move into a modern world. And I'm working with some of these nations to bring in some products. Monies that are made at these events go to the communities. There's an organization called the Authentic Indigenous Seafood, which has 13 indigenous nations involved, all interior and are traditionally harvested. And talk about beautiful products. Salmon from the Githala, from the Lake Babine, from the Niska. And these are all being sold in the stores now and are being used at some conventions and banquets. And I got a hold of my friend who's a corporate chef at Premium Brand Holdings, is working with the Mi'kmaq and the Mi'kmaq lobster and the Sitka Nation out of Alberta that will hopefully in one day supply all the buffalo needs in the restaurants and hotels. And it's a free roaming herd in their nation, and it's bringing back all the plants, it's bringing back all the wildlife. So there's ways of doing this together. But at the end of the day, it's not for profit. It's about customs and feeding people. And I think that's the biggest problem that went wrong with the food systems in the modern world is we started producing food for money and not food for people. And we overproduce food and it goes to waste. So again, I take my hats off to Dan's Legacy for looking at this, and let's use some of this before it goes to the landfill. And this is good food. We've nourished a lot of kids. They change lives for the better. And it actually encourages those young kids that go through that program to move forward in life. And I think it's key for your next question to have role models in this world. Back then, I never really had a role model as a chef because, as you said, I just accidentally became a chef and how I got here. We didn't have cooking shows like this way back in the 80s. I think we had Cooking with Yan or somebody, which was actually quite funny, actually. But having a role model, I think, is key. And my role models have always been my parents, my grandparents on both sides, and listening to their direction and their experience in life. And I think that's the key to Indigenous knowledge. It's all built on real experience. In the Western world, it's all theory-based. When your theory goes sideways, so does everything else. So I think traditional knowledge in food will really help a lot of people. And the reason why I'm really stuck on food rescue is our urban populations of Indigenous peoples. We have a massive amount of people that live in urban settings and it's getting tougher out here. But through these programs and the relationships built.
2020 Indigenous peoples in Greater Vancouver alone. And I just wanted to ask you briefly here, Chief George, about education. I've heard from those within the Greater Vancouver Indigenous communities that students are still often directed towards those, or they are, as they go through high school, not pushed to their potential. Not always, but it happens. They come graduated, they want to do a certain profession and they don't have the requirement. Now, there's lots of organizations, Access being one I know of, so there's other great ones that help to bring them up to speed and train them for specific sectors. And my question for you, you experience not being able to access the education. And today, we're seeing it, well, Indigenous peoples are experiencing in our school systems.
Oh, big time. And it's getting deeper because of DRIPA. And again, I think there are solutions when we work together on this, and it's an educational system for one.
Yeah.
A level playing field for everybody because, the educational system is very unfair. And our people are left behind the eight ball the minute we're born. We're already in how we're treated in school and treated like we're have the inability to learn, which is the furthest thing from the truth. Being silent doesn't mean that you don't understand. It's cultural. And we're taught to speak when we're asked to speak. And we're never taught things to memorize things and go through a quiz. And this is where the closest thing to how we're taught, which is called grooming, is an apprenticeship. It's a lifelong journey of learning. And education is only one proponent of that. And that's what's missing in the Western world, is education is only one small proponent of learning. In the Western world, they look at learning as everything, and they look at having those letters behind your name. Because you have that letter behind your name doesn't mean you have common sense. So how we're taught with dignity, with care, there's no shouting, there's no exam, there's no certification, and it's handed down from generation to generation through oral history. And we're shown by hand, this is how you do it. And again, when we go back to cooking, that's how I was taught on a wood stove. My grandmothers and my mom never followed a recipe. It was always by tasting and here, try this, try that. And they never measured it. It was just amazing. What I liked about that, again, we have an empty deep freeze. And before you know it, my mom would produce this amazing meal. And I'm just like, the holy smokes. But again, going back to what you said there again, I think through an even playing field for everybody and understanding just the Indigenous knowledge and the different ways of doing things. So it's wrong to say there's only one way to achieve things. And when you look at our people, there's different ways of learning, and it's not just Indigenous people. Everybody has,
Neurodivergent.
everybody learns at a different pace. Everybody learns differently. And that's why I love being a chef instructor or teaching. Is I love when I see the light go on. And it's not just Indigenous, right across the board, and they love it, and it changes their world. And that's what this is all about, is changing people's lives for the better through food and education. And again, when you look at what's going on in the downtown east side, no one ever goes down there to live like that. What they're doing is surviving, and a lot of what I see is self-medication through mental health. And again, this is where Dan's legacy can play a big role. This is where food can play a big role of helping them nourish themselves, getting well and looking at, okay, now I'm well, let's think about getting out of here, let's get in it. How do I get out of here? get an education. Education opens the door to a lot of opportunities, and not just a Western education or a traditional education, and teaching our kids you can always go home. Not like the old days of, fear of losing your kids to the residential school, they'll never ever see them again. We should have that ability to let our youth spread their wings, fly, explore the world, and bring it home. That's what this is all about, but we can't achieve that unless we address the food.
Very well said. I wanted to ask you as we wrap up, Chief slash Chef George, how can people who are privileged to have food on their plate, food in their shopping carts, best support the needs around hunger in the province today?
That's a very good question. And first of all, there's some sayings in our culture. And before you go around judging people, have a look at yourself. In our languages, in Zen, my mom always said that, have a look at yourself. Why are you talking about them when you have to have a look at yourself? So
Can you repeat that again?
it's my mom used to say in Zen, which means have a look at yourself before you judge anybody else. And that's key, I think. If you're going around judging people and you don't have a look at yourself and how you act, and again, when you look at privilege and access to food, I think it is wrong. And what that boils down to is the modern production. Somebody shopping at Fresh Street versus somebody going to the food bank. They're the same. We bleed the same. We breathe the same. We get up, we put one leg in our pant and the other leg just the same as all the others. It should be the same in food. So to the rich people that are privileged out there, is not just to feel guilty about anything. That's not what this is about. Is have some empathy, reach out, become a voice of change, and say, how can I help? That's how change is made, and it's made by a community. And it starts with the individual, starts with the person. And once you get that, and when you look at yourself and understand yourself and say, okay, I have some things to offer. And that's, I think, if we all do that, I think we'd be in a better world.
That's great, Council. I'm going to email you afterwards to get the proper spelling for Anzen.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure if I use that on Twitter, people will just be baffled. I say it in English and it doesn't seem to get through, but maybe this will.
Well, it's kind of reverse psychology, right? And when you look at it in a non-native world, is have a look at yourself before you talk about somebody else. And it's a real loud message when you say it that way. But our elders say it in a really calm manner. Just, hey, don't do that. Have a look at yourself. But the big piece is empathy and dropping your guard. One thing I noticed, and it's in every culture. I was walking with my son down in White Rock along the pier there. And my son, he said, look at that guy. He's looking really pretty grumpy. Just like people like that. And I smiled at him and said, good morning. And that guy, hey, good morning. How are you doing? Blah, blah. I said, see, first impression. And I said, don't go on that. I said, a simple smile will change their day. And it's true. You treat people how you want to be treated, it'll be a different world. And that's another message to the rich and privileged out there. Treat people how you want to be treated. If you want to be treated with respect, well, respect others.
And a reminder that anyone is only one step or change away from being on the other side of things, whether it be poverty, homelessness, substance use disorder. Things happen in people's lives and nobody's immune.
No, I appreciate that comment because when you look at the indigenous cultures across the world, we share our food and everybody benefits. And you look at some of these mosques and you look at some of these events in the city, they share their food and they gladly share it with a big smile. So it's not all about selling it and making a profit out of it. And I think that's a lesson learned through culture. It's just sharing your culture through food. And it's amazing to watch when you go to some of these events and see the look on these people's faces. Oh my God, you try this? This is amazing. And to me, it just brings culture into your lives and makes you a better human being at the end of the day, too.
What would be your advice if I was to want to bring my family for Indigenous food at a restaurant, a food truck, something anywhere in Greater Vancouver? Is there a place you'd recommend?
Start with Salmon Bannock on Nez's restaurant on Oak and Broadway. She is fantastic. Another thing is there's some food trucks in and around the city that are amazing. If you're in and around the province, Coulee Cafe makes enough amazing fried bread and so on. And but the big thing is there's a lot of celebrations throughout the province and in Canada. Taking a powwow. You don't have to be invited. Lots of food and culture there, even a potlatch in your community. Ask, hey, can I attend one of those? And go in and experience some of the moose soup that we serve, the bannock, the berries, the singing, the dancing, the culture that's behind all of the food. And that's my advice is just go explore uh, in the city, just like any other celebration, whether it's the Caribbean or the Greek festival or Italian days. There's the Squamish Youth Powwow coming up next month, and lots of food and barbecued salmon. There's powwows at Trout Lake. The big one though is the Kamloops in Kamloops, and again that's massive. There's Crab Fest going on in Prince Rupert and Salmon Festival, so look those up. Join the community, and you know what? They will welcome you, and that's
It's
what this is
beautiful. It's
about.
beautiful. Thank you so much. It's been a privilege and honor to have you on the podcast. I've been speaking today with Chief Andrew George, Hereditary Wing Chief of the what? So what's it?
So at the
Bear
end, yeah,
Clan.
Bear
What's
Clan.
what's on
Yep. Hey, there you go.
Bear Clan, BC's first Indigenous Red Seal chef, a director at Dan's Legacy. We will put full link to his bio below the episode. I encourage you to have a look at Dan's Legacy. They're on Instagram at Dan's Legacy BC, and we will link to all of their social media
I'm proud.
as well.
I'm proud to say to wrap it all up. My dad's recipe and my mom's recipe is the bannock used at the FIFA World Cup, and so the salmon bannock that was created at Expo '86 and making a comeback at FIFA. And there's a lot of indigenous cuisine in the executive suites. And the last piece is they're bringing in a lot of indigenous youth now to work in the concession stands and help with that. So thank you so much.
Amazing. Wonderful. Thank you for being here and for sharing not only your experiences, but your knowledge and your teachings.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure. And the more we teach, the better opportunity we have to live together.
I agree. Thank you so much.